Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Bing Crosby, and Peter Falk on
Who you
the
don't
record.
think of as a singer.
So, no, and there's a reason for it. You know, the obvious inclusion is in the Wee Small Hours, considered by many to be Sinatra's best ballad album. The Wee Small Hours was the album that really cemented him in terms of his reemergence as a star in the early 1950s and as a vocalist. It's the first time he worked with Nelson Riddle, I believe, or one of the first times he worked with Nelson Riddle, but really the album that crystallized the signature sound of their association. That's on my list for that reason.
What do you think attracted you to that Sinatra sound initially?
Largely because I was a big fan of film scores when I was in school. I loved John Williams, I loved Jerry Goldsmith and Elmer Bernstein and James Horner and Bruce Broughton and these composers who were writing contemporary classical music and offering something that was so different than what we were getting in every other platform. I remember oftentimes they would release the score for a Spielberg movie before it would even come out. So I remember listening to the Jurassic Park score a few weeks at least before the movie came out and having nothing to really associate it with. But at the same time, the music was just so great and it was John Williams doing what he does. In the Wee Small Hours is a great example of what drew me to Sinatra in the first place. It really was the orchestrations. I found his music and found a connection to his music through that back door. What I felt when I was hearing his ballad recordings was that I was listening to a vocalist singing to a film score. You could pull his vocal out of the rest of the recording, and what you were hearing was still a very listenable example of high musicality. And that was something I discovered in college accidentally, for whatever reason, picking up a Sinatra album at the record store and listening and discovering that what I thought this guy was, you know, about 2% of what he really was. And when I listen to a vocal recording, the orchestration is something that I really do look for. And it's why I'm drawn to so much of this older music, because it's an art form that I think has been lost just artistically, but also doesn't really it's not needed as much as it was. Stylistically, it's just not something that is as essential for the kind of music that we're making today. It's a lot cheaper to do things electronically or use 5 musicians instead of 50 musicians. The trade-off is there are certain sounds you just can't get. I mean, even with a string section, if you have 4 or 5 strings, you can get a certain type of sound. If you have 25 or 30 strings, you can get a very different type of sound that you can't otherwise. And I mean, I think in some ways that use of a symphonic sound became synonymous to a certain generation with their parents' music. And so when the 60s and 70s came around, there was sort of a rebellion against that. I'm by no means a scholar on this. This is just my own perception. But when I listened to the music that my parents liked, which oddly was, from a later era than what I responded to, it's very sparse. It's like, it's acoustic guitar. It's that folksy kind of Peter, Paul and Mary era sound that was really it was really in many ways a rejection of the puffy, full sound of the big bands or the jazz orchestras from the 50s that they've been raised on. So I think that's part of it. And I think that's a sensibility that just kind of stuck through many, many decades and just never came back around. I don't know that in a contemporary pop song that there is a need for a 55-piece orchestra. I think the complexity of the chord changes and things that they were doing back then they just don't really fit now. There's a simplicity that is much more in vogue, that has been in vogue for a long time. And a song, like Shadow of Your Smile by Johnny Mandel, which has these amazingly unexpected wanderings in terms of the melody. I don't know if it would fly now. I'd love to say that it would, but I just think it's just fallen out of fashion. The next one is another Sinatra ballad album, Only the Lonely, which is my personal favorite. That to me was what had begun with Wee Small Hours essentially reaching its apex. It was Sinatra reaching his vocal peak in the late 50s and Nelson Riddle as an arranger and an orchestrator completely coming out of his shell and being allowed to be as expressive as he was capable of. And I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that Sinatra loved the orchestra. He really understood what an orchestra could do for a vocal. He was a great vocalist in some of our opinions, the greatest vocalist in the history of popular music, but he also understood what a chart could do for the recording. And I think the power of his recordings is partially attributable to what he understood about the orchestra and the fact that he knew that if I let people like Nelson Riddle and Billy May and Don Costa do what they do and not worry about them eating me alive as a vocalist, I'm going to get something great. And in many ways, it's like making a movie. It's like there's two ways to make a movie. You can be a director who micromanages everything, or you can recognize that each department head on your set can probably do their job better than you can do their job. And if you have a cohesive vision, but at the same time you allow them to stretch as much as they can while still, making sure that you're all making the same movie, you'll get something that's better than the totality of each one of you. And I think Frank understood that about the orchestra better than anyone, really, with the exception and inclusion of Nat King Cole, who also really understood it. And you hear it as much as any of his albums on Only the Lonely. I think that's probably the best example of that in play. What's interesting is he did originate it. I mean, In the Wee Small Hours was essentially the first album that fits the definition of an album as we know it today. That it was two sides of a record, and there was a constant theme of regret and loss of love, start to finish, and all felt really, really cohesive. And that album never really gets the proper recognition that it deserves for really being the first to do that. I picked Two of a Kind by Johnny Mercer and Bobby Darin, with arrangements by Billy May. To me, it's a great example of an album that is just pure fun. It's preparation that you can hear, but at the same time, once those tapes started rolling, you can hear that everyone in the room is just having a blast. You have Johnny Mercer, who was one of the great songwriters of all time, and for what he did, a fine vocalist. Bobby Darin, of course, who's Bobby Darin, and Billy May, who did all the arrangements for the record. And it's essentially just two singers in the studio having a great time with these magnificent jazz arrangements by this brilliant jazz arranger. And I think what it embodies for me is the difference in how the production process is weighted nowadays as opposed to what it was back then. You really get the sense that this thing was prepped and rehearsed, certainly in terms of the band's part of things, so that by the time they got into the studio, it almost mixed itself, and what you were essentially getting was a live recording that can then just be sent off to the public without a whole lot of post work. And nowadays, I think it's very different. I think you can sometimes go months and months in post after that time in the studio. And so what you're getting is something that's just different than what it was on the day. This album is a snapshot in time. What we're hearing is what happened in that studio, and yet it sounds so polished and so perfect. And it's just a testament to, look, let me put it this way. Like I met Steve Lawrence before he passed away at a show in Vegas a number of years back. He to me is one of the most underrated vocalists of all time for that genre. His voice always sounds like it's doing exactly what he wants it to do. There's just no effort whatsoever. This amazing tone, this amazing control, and at the same time so relaxed and selfless. He is singing for you, the audience, and not for himself. And I said to him, how did you guys do it? How did you not, because we all will hear something that bugs us, and it's like, let's go back and fix that. As much as you want it to be all live, which we do try to do, but now and then, we will go back and be like, yeah, that's a little bit of a clam. Let's fix this. I said, how did you do that? How did you guys all do that? And he said, we had to. You didn't have a choice. There was no post-production. There was no months of mixing afterwards. It was there on the day, and so much of this was live board mixes. We try to do that as much as we can, and I think for the most part we succeed. But there is always that safety net that those guys didn't have. And Two of a Kind is a great example of an album with no safety net, that you listen and you realize what I'm hearing is what happened in that room on that day, and it's just magical. You can get a little lazy, I think. You see it in a lot of cases with things like auto-tune. You can go in and fix anything. I do think there was a time when, if we take the record day as the fulcrum point, here's the preparation and here's the post-work. I think that has tipped very much from one side to the other in the past, half century. There was preparation, and then here comes the record day, and then you're not completely done, but basically done. And off it goes to be pressed into wax. And now I think while there is still prep and there's songwriting, that initial studio day, the weight isn't on it the way it might have been if it was, the Beatles walking into a session, and what they got on that day was what they got. But I think it's just different. I think there were limitations. And, it's just a different kind of art form. Like the role of a producer in post with an album now is just very different, and it's a lot heavier. There's a lot more that's that's going on, for better and worse, depending on your perspective. Back then you had to be ready on the day because you couldn't do 3 months of post work. You couldn't go in and tweak and separate tracks and do this and do that. What you were hearing was what was in the room. So many of those old records were recordings of live performances, effectively. There's something that kind of connects you to the album in a way that maybe is not quite the same when you're listening to something that's been heavily produced. I mean, in simplest terms, the power has gone from the songwriter and the composer to the producer in a lot of ways. And Sinatra and Riddle, in many ways, they effectively produced those albums just by virtue of recording them and making those decisions on the day. I have Fancy Meeting You Here, which is another duet album with Bing Crosby and Rosemary Clooney. Generally considered the best album that those two legendary performers ever recorded together, and they recorded a lot together. They were a legendary male-female singing duo. Much like Bobby Darin and Johnny Mercer, you can hear the fun that they're having in the room on that record. Also a Billy May arranged album. And for me, that album is significant because more than any other record, it's defined what my singing partner Liz Gillies and I have tried to do on the recordings that we've made. We've done two records, one that was sort of a compilation during COVID, and another that called We Wish You the Merriest, which was our Christmas album that came out a couple years ago. This album is very much a template for what we were trying to achieve with those recordings. Just this feeling of serious orchestral arrangement against the sound of two vocalists just having a great time recording. The Concert Sinatra, which is completely the opposite. This was the first time that Sinatra and Riddle had recorded with an ensemble this large. It was probably about 70 pieces, I think, and it was the early 60s. And it was songs that you probably couldn't record necessarily with a smaller orchestra and have that kind of impact. It included Soliloquy from Carousel. It included Old Man River, which is probably one of his greatest recordings ever. It included an orchestral symphonic version of Bewitched, the Rodgers and Hart song. This Nearly Was Mine, I think, was on there from South Pacific. It was a lot of showy kind of tunes that were not necessarily, they weren't swing, they weren't gentle ballads. They were designed to be symphonic. It was designed to make you feel like you were at a symphony show. It's not necessarily the kind of album you sit down and listen to while you're, making dinner. It's an album you sit down and listen to while you're doing nothing else and just kind of take in the texture and complexity of what's going on. Songs from St. Louis Blues, which was Nat King Cole and Nelson Riddle. I've never seen the movie. To my knowledge, it's the only time Nat King Cole ever did a film where he was the lead actor. I could be wrong about that. But there's a great soundtrack album that actually has an overture that leads into a Nat King Cole recording. The Rat Pack Live at the Sands, which is great for a number of reasons, but as an engineering achievement, which oftentimes doesn't get, the credit that it deserves as a craft, it's the most crisp live recording from that era I think I've ever heard. And I mean, it's like you're in the room with the crowd that night, and it was probably late. It was probably like 1 a.m. What he pulled off in that room that night is just a gift to all of us who weren't born early enough to go see those shows at the Sands. It's an amazing album. Oscar Peterson and Nelson Riddle, that's literally just the name of the album. Two great musicians who they're both at their best. It's all instrumental. There are no vocals. It's all just a great pianist and a great arranger working together, and it's all standards. It's a very underrated recording. Sunday in New York with music by Peter Nero, the pianist. Again, a film I have never seen, but it's some of the craziest piano score you've ever heard in your life. It is, I've never seen the movie, so I have no idea how it fits and how it doesn't just completely take over everything that's going on screen. It's an amazing series of recordings. Again, not something that you listen to casually. It's really esoteric piano/orchestral arrangement. Highly recommended. It's, again, not an easy listen, but if you can power through it, it's definitely rewarding. And then the last one, another soundtrack, Robin and the Seven Hoods. Not a great movie, but a great album. Again, has a Nelson Riddle overture that's one of his best pieces of arranging ever. Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., and Bing Crosby. And Peter Falk, who also sings on
who you don't think of as a singer.
You don't know, and there's a reason for it. Peter Falk has a song on the record, and he told them he doesn't sing, and they were like, don't worry about it. You're playing a gangster, you'll be fine. But there are some just great arrangements, great songs by Sammy Cahn and Jimmy Van Heusen, arranged by Nelson Riddle. All four of these singers, an amazing orchestra. It's just this confluence of talent that I don't know that we've heard before or since in that world at that time. It's just all of these great talents coming together. There's a song called I Like to Lead When I Dance, very underrated Sinatra recording. There's a song called Style that Crosby and Dean Martin and Frank all sing together. That's sort of a round type of tune. It's great. I mean, it's an okay movie with just a spectacular score and great set of songs.